Marlet, if she's still in the room, is not here. Did a great job, I thought, of a good science and technology overview. And we've got Peter back on the panel to discuss GIS for wicked problems, in addition to Nancy von Meyer and Stan Meiburg. This is our panel right here. These are great, great people. And I guess you guys have gotten a sense for the kind of intellect I think that we have here, and I'm very excited about the content and the discussion and everything you all are contributing. So let's hear from, we have Peter first, I guess just because you're just going to segue us from lunch into this panel, and then Stan Meiburg, and then Nancy von Meyer, and then we'll open it for discussion.
Hello again. I'm going to be very brief so my colleagues up here have more time. You already heard my spiel. I just want to sort of start off and finish with that map I ended up with in the last talk, the California water map. And really, you know, I realized after I put the talk together, I didn't talk about any specific issue that we put this map together for. But basically, the one that which sort of triggered this was the question that we got from Congress was about the 2007-2009 drought in California. Was it a natural drought? Was it a human-induced drought? And to help answer that question, we, among other things, put together this map and then used it to kind of show where water was going, where it wasn't, why was it being curtailed, what was the reservoir capacity, and basically use it as the tool to sort of discuss, well, yeah, there's aspects of the natural drought. Precipitation was down, reservoir levels are down. But then, as I mentioned in my talk over noon, there are all these other restrictions in place for endangered species, among other things, that also restricted the flow of water. So, you know, it's a classic wicked problem. Yes, it's a human-induced drought. Yes, it's a natural drought. Depending on what side of the issue, how you define it and how you, what reasons you decide are in your interest to promote, you can answer that question. And lastly, I mean, this is sort of, we think, a GIS product that we're going to develop and update maybe in perpetuity, because the problem will never go away. And you can just imagine all the other layers we're looking at right now, the agriculture production layers, groundwater banks, other sources of supply, bringing in the Colorado River, and expanding it or improving and also just keeping it up to date. So we think it's one example where GIS and geospatial data are going to help us for a long time, simply because the problem probably won't get any easier. I didn't even talk about, you know, one of my colleagues here on the table mentioned, well, what about the levees and the potential for earthquakes, and the earthquakes destroying the levees? That's a whole other issue that we could place on here. What's the seismic risk? Because if there's an earthquake in California and the levees that are in the Central Valley go away, the whole area fills up with salt water, and then you've got another maybe 2 orders of magnitude of wickedness. So just to finish, and so let my colleagues have the time, this, I think, is sort of where we like to go with other problems that we're facing, this type of product. And to date, Congress, the staff members, the offices we've talked with, like this at face value, just like seeing everything on one page, if you will. And we're slowly sort of developing ways to use the analytical tools to help them carve off problems, parts of this problem, to make them less wicked. So.
Good afternoon. In contrast to Peter's comment about how nobody's ever heard of the CRS, for better or for worse, most people have heard of the EPA. I'm glad that we're having a discussion this afternoon about wicked problems as opposed to wicked agencies. Let me say just a little bit about, 2 seconds about sort of geospatial aspects with respect to EPA regional offices, because regions are in fact geographic. If you look at all of EPA, which is about 17,000 people, roughly half of the component of EPA is located in regional offices, of which there are 10 in the standard federal regions. And you are in Region 4 here in Atlanta, and we cover North Carolina to Florida, over to Mississippi, and up to Kentucky, which includes 60 million people, 103 members of Congress, more wetlands and coastline than any of the other EPA regions in the lower 48 states, and ecosystems that run all the way from the Everglades to the mountains of Kentucky. So it's a wide variety of issues. And when I was thinking about this question of wicked water problems, it is certainly a target-rich environment here in the Southeast. I would like to note, sort of in response to Peter's comment, that I was thinking about his characteristics of wickedness, and I would propose that what I heard and what certainly my experience is that Wickedness increases as a function of competing policy objectives, complex ecosystems, overlapping political jurisdictions, and the complexity of governance structures. That the more of those things go up, the wickeder it gets. And like I said, it's a target-rich environment, so I thought I'd just throw out for illustration this morning, or this afternoon, 3 examples of those. And they are the Everglades, the dredging of Savannah Harbor, and water wars. And the first is the Everglades, and this is a map of the northern portion of the Everglades area just immediately south of Lake Okeechobee. And the 4 words I want you to remember with respect to the Everglades are quantity, quality, timing, and distribution, all of which are factors in thinking about water in the Everglades. Now, this is a wicked problem because it meets all the characteristics that were described earlier. You have a very complex ecosystem, a unique ecosystem in the southern Everglades, which has been significantly altered over the last 200 years by human impact to serve a variety of purposes, and very much is not what it was back in colonial times. And the alterations of these things, combined with a growing awareness and sensitivity to trying to maintain what is left of the Everglades, creates a very interesting policy environment. Among the values to be conserved in the Everglades are endangered species, things such as the Cape sable sparrow, as well as other, the Florida panther, other kinds of species that really are quite unique to the Everglades and the river of grass ecosystem. This also is a water supply area for South Florida, which is has been one of the fastest growing areas in the entire United States. So that becomes another competing policy objective. And then you have agriculture. You see on the map the Everglades agricultural area, which is a very rich agricultural area for both vegetables and for sugarcane, and was influenced by the takeover of Cuba by Castro, and the closing of the sugarcane market all of a sudden created a great boom expansion in sugarcane production there in the Everglades agricultural area. And to make sugarcane and other crops, you add fertilizer, which means you're increasing levels of phosphorus going into the Everglades, and the Everglades itself was a phosphorus-starved ecosystem and depended upon having very low levels of phosphorus in the water column. Well, when you start adding fertilizers, then you change the ecosystem irrevocably and start having all kinds of alterations, and therein creates another element of wickedness in terms of competing policy objectives. Work is underway right now to try to restore the Everglades. This is after decades of trying to create structures that would control the Everglades in some way, shape, or form to provide for water supply, as well as to prevent flooding in the event of hurricanes. The Corps of Engineers spent 30, 40 years trying to do that, and then has spent the last 30, 40 years trying to undo it, or at least to mitigate the effects of some of the changes which created unanticipated results, and to heighten the awareness of water quality in the Everglades. This creates some interesting dilemmas. For example, in discussions that are going on as we speak, you'll look at this, in that middle of the chart, you'll see little things that are labeled STAs. An STA is a stormwater treatment area. And the idea is to take runoff stormwater from the agricultural area, have it pass through those STAs, which are marshlands designed to promote the uptake of phosphorus, so that when the water comes out of those things, you have much lower phosphorus levels that would then reduce impacts in these various conservation areas, the Loxahatchee Natural Wildlife Refuge and the other water conservation areas down below. And so by the time it gets to Everglades National Park, you have phosphorus levels down below 10 parts per billion, which is pretty low. As you can imagine, all just by looking at it, the geospatial systems are tremendously important. There's a tremendous amount of modeling that goes on to try to determine how big a stormwater treatment area do you need to reduce a given concentration of phosphorus in water down to levels that would be acceptable to prevent ecosystem impacts. You have to model the actual flows of water. This area is extraordinarily flat, and that inches per mile make a difference in which way the water goes. So that's very important to be able to see it. Plus, just being able to see all this in one place, there are really 3 flow paths, an eastern, central, and western flow path, and they have somewhat different dynamics. For example, you look in the western flow path, you'll see down right below the Everglades agricultural area are 2 tribal reservations for the Seminoles and the Miccosukes. And the Seminoles and Miccosukes have been very concerned about the impact of nutrient-rich water on their own lands, and have litigated against the federal government in order to compel Florida and the federal government to clean up the water going into their areas. So you have immense complexity. You have water quality management districts in Florida, the state of Florida, the federal structure in the Clean Water Act, a consent decree in the eastern flow path, litigation by Judge Gold in the western flow path. It is a seriously, seriously wicked problem. One that almost ended up getting the administrator of EPA cited for contempt, and we have avoided that for the moment. So that's, and this is one which you'll continue to read about. It's a great policy challenge. This is the largest ecosystem restoration project in the entire world. The Corps of Engineers has spent, and the state of Florida has spent billions of dollars trying to restore flows, but as many people point out, getting flows down so you have a river of grass doesn't do any good for the ecosystem unless you have flows of clean water. And how you get that, how you structure it, who pays, you'll never be back entirely to natural systems, but there you are. The next wicked problem we're facing is the Savannah Harbor. For those of you in Georgia know how important the Port of Savannah is to the Georgia economy. It is a wicked problem because it's not just when you go in and dredge the harbor from 42 feet to 47 feet, you're facing a couple of challenges. One is the fact that Savannah Harbor is way upstream from the mouth of the Savannah River. So it's a pretty long reach that you have to go in. And consequently, you get saltwater wedges, you get potential impacts on drinking water in Savannah, you get conversion of freshwater marshes to saltwater marshes, which produces ecological disruption. Some of the sediment being dredged has naturally occurring levels of cadmium in it that have to be managed in terms of where you can dispose of this sediment, either upland or in ocean disposal sites. But in some ways, the wickedness of this problem is contributed to by political issues as well. The Savannah River forms the border between Georgia and South Carolina, and there are those in South Carolina who feel that anything that makes Savannah more attractive works to the detriment of the interests of the Port of Charleston. And so this has created some very interesting dynamics which have centered around water quality impacts and whether or not the mitigation that's been proposed for the dredging project in terms of increasing dissolved oxygen in the river is really going to do the job. A very fascinating example where the legislature went in and overrode a determination made by the South Carolina Department of Health and Environmental Control. So again, a good example of a wicked water problem which has the same elements: complex governance, complex ecosystems, competing purposes, competing uses. And then finally, the last slide is one that will be familiar to all of you here in the Atlanta area, which is affectionately known as water wars, or more appropriately, the Apalachicola-Chattahoochee-Flint River Basin. The underlying dilemma here is that you have a large metropolitan area situated and dependent for its supply of water on a very small watershed, at least comparatively speaking. And so you have the city of Atlanta and the environs, which have grown tremendously in the last 30 years, dependent upon the Chattahoochee River Basin for its water supply. 75% of the water storage in this basin is in Lake Lanier. And so when we have a drought and Lake Lanier starts to drain up, then you got a problem in Atlanta. On the other hand, the whole riverine system is also dependent upon releases from Lake Lanier in order to maintain navigation down at the mouth of the river, to maintain the appropriate salinity gradient for Apalachicola oysters, which are famous around the world, in order to maintain supply for power plants that are located along the Chattahoochee, and to maintain certain levels of water quality, given that here in Atlanta, all of our wastewater discharges, or most of it, discharges into the Chattahoochee River. And if you don't have enough minimum flow coming down, then you create a water quality problem as a result of those discharges. So I give this as an example of, again, the way in which all of these problems benefit in terms of how they're perceived by geospatial analysis, simply to portray, as Peter said to people, how what the problem actually looks like and to get a larger perspective on it. But the analytical tools that go behind it are complex, and what I find, at least in my role, is oftentimes we are now at the point where we can get up nice pictures that display the situation. What we're sometimes lacking is the data behind those pictures to be able to tell the full story. Thank you very much.
So based on the discussion, I'm sort of reflecting on changing the content a little bit. So the slides are just here for your background amusement. We're talking a lot about zoom in, zoom out, which is an interesting concept, but like so many other things, not new, right? When I was in graduate school, one of the things we talked about is, which is comparable to that statement, is that the human mind is one of the few organisms that can simultaneously think about the concept of motherhood and the specific instance of your own mom at the same time. So you can zoom out to motherhood and you can zoom in to your mom simultaneously. And it almost seems like that's what we're doing here. We're thinking about these large issues, and yet we're thinking about the specific instance of, what about my backyard? So when I hear Stan talk about the Savannah Harbor, I'm telling Peter, yeah, but you know, the real solution to Savannah Harbor is send the ships to Charleston. I mean, we're from South Carolina, we know that. I mean, what's the issue here? Like, just don't dredge the thing, just send them up the coast a bit. The other thing that's interesting to think about is that parcel data is personal, right? In the United States, it's a very, and actually I would suggest that internationally, parcel is a very personal, thing. We talked a little bit about technology, and this is an interesting statistic, there are more iPhones sold than babies born every day. That's a pretty interesting statistic. And there are 700,000 Android devices activated every day. That's a lot of tablet, that's a lot of mobile computing, that's a lot of probes. Every one of those devices is a probe of the environment that gives us a real-time, zoomed-in sample, right? So if I turn the tracking on my cell phone, and if we all did, and there's 700,000 activated every day, and 400,000 coming online every day, at some point we're at a 1-to-1. I mean, how much more zoomed in can you get than if every human walking is a sample point? And why not? Why not do that? Why not make every single person a sample point? When we talked about the social media, I don't know, I mean, I use all this stuff. It's great, right, to be able to just turn on Pandora and get whatever music you want whenever you want it, and when any new music comes out, it just it suggests new tunes to you. I mean, how cool is that, right? I mean, we used to have to listen, I'm from up north, we used to have to listen to WLS out of Chicago, and they'd tell us what was cool, but now Pandora just picks it for us. So, I mean, why parcels? Parcels are the ultimate zoomed in. They're not really a strategic problem, although they have the characteristics of a wicked problem. For all of the reasons that you mentioned, Stan, I mean, the complex governments, the overlapping jurisdictions, the competing interests, the complex ecology, only it's a human ecology, the competing interest within the tax office. But you know, we have this reason in the United States on purpose. This was intentional. This goes all the way back to Jefferson and Hamilton, right? So Jefferson was the original Tea Party guy, right? Jefferson did not want federal government. It was Hamilton that wanted the central bank, not Jefferson. Jefferson wanted the smallest government possible. He didn't, you know, he thought the federal government could meet one week a year. He wasn't into traveling. He wanted to stay home on his farm, right? He wasn't into going into Washington every day. And so that was part of the design of the legislation, and that was he decentralized parcels, he decentralized land ownership. This is by design. So when you hear people talk about, well, they've solved this problem in Denmark, they've solved this problem in Germany, you have your standard canned responses, but we had Thomas Jefferson and you didn't. So TJ is our guy, and we had him, and because of that, everything is different, right? So it's not the same at all. When we talk about why do we need parcels and what issue do they solve, this is from the Federal Communications, the broadband connections. It's the idea is to deliver the broadband connection to every single household. It's every single household on every single parcel, right, is going to get high-speed access to support these mobile devices that are coming out like mad. This might be by census tract, but ultimately it has to be parcel by parcel. When we talk about wildland fire, I mean, we put together 500 counties worth of data for wildland fire in the West, and they have this data, and anytime there's a burn, and there are almost 200 brand new wildland fires every single day, and every one of those gets mapped and the parcel data gets thrown down, and we find out how many structures are at risk. So we talk about risk mitigation. First thing we do is throw down the parcel data and find out what's at risk. Are there any pipelines? Are there any power lines? Are there any homes? Are there any barns? Are there any government structures? If there are none of those, let it burn. We do not have the money, the resources, the time, the energy to deal with every single fire. There's too many of them. So they're balanced every day in terms of how do we mitigate our response? How do we balance the risk versus the price of responding to it? And our government does this, the US government in conjunction with the states does this every single day. They make some mistakes. You know, Jefferson County fire this year was kind of blown, that was a mistake, but generally this works pretty well. And then the other question is like, how much data do we really need? So we've talked a lot about how much data do we have to have, and I've always contended, and I have a dog, so we have this dog we rescued, and he's mostly lab, but I say he has his own inner terrier. And this inner terrier is part of the cross, and it keeps him, when we go down to the river to walk, he wades, he doesn't go all the way out like a lab, right? So a lab, you throw anything into the water, the dog's gone, right? My dog, you throw something in the water, and he looks at you like, that was stupid. So he wades, and I call that his inner terrier. So I'm a land surveyor, but I have an inner GIS. And so my inner GIS says, my surveyor in me says, get it surveyed. That's what GIS stands for, get it surveyed. Everything needs to be well known, and if we had everything, if we had perfect information, if every droid had good GPS and we had 1 million sample points every day out there collecting the real environment, why would anyone have to go outside, right? Just pull up your screen and sample the probes out there. But my inner GIS says that that's not necessarily a good solution, that what we should really do is the least accurate and the less dense information that you can get away with to answer the question is what you should do. That sometimes you can overwhelm yourself with data. And if you add one more piece of information, did you improve the decision or did you complicate the answer? So I think every decision has a break point where one more piece of information is one piece too many. And I think our job, I think what separates the GIS professional from somebody just adding layers to a Google map is that we have to judiciously make that cutoff. We have to say, you know what? and when we were working with the housing crisis, they said, oh, we want to get all the parcel data for the United States. Great idea. You know, it's 150 million parcels, and they change every single day. That's a really great idea. Let's get all of them and put them in a central data house. Let's put them on geodata.gov. That's a good idea. Right. And then we'll manage them with 4,221 jurisdictions, updating them every day on a daily basis. Wrong answer, right? Let's figure out what's the break point. What's the least amount of information that we can get away with that will yield the same result, that will give us the most efficient decision making. And I think that's the role of the GIS professional, and I think that the parcel data is one of the data sets that drives that home, because it's just it's an unwieldy, wicked problem if you don't do that. I'm not going to take you through the rest of these slides because it's parcel data. I can talk all day and I won't do that.
All right, so let's open it up to you guys. Your turn. Thoughts, questions, comments?
Thank you. Question, please, for any one of you. One of the distinguishing characteristics of the Western economies is parcel data. It's about their ability to be able to raise and manage capital. From an international viewpoint, what do you think the outlook is for our participation using geospatial sciences to contribute to a knowledge base that better distributes capital in other countries?
Hurricane Katrina, for example, in my mind, was an example of how we could have taken advantage of jurisdictional boundaries, ownership.
The use of capital, a lot of communication but that same kind of catastrophe occurs elsewhere for which the burdens fall exclusively, not on local and state and federal units, but on perhaps country units alone.
I can speak to that a little bit from the standpoint, it's not quite on the point of distributed capital, it certainly is a critical point in emergency response. I mean, one of the strategic questions facing the country in response to either catastrophes or in response potentially to what some see as a potential impact of climate change is, should you be investing capital in areas that are inherently at significant risk? That does depend very heavily on having accurate, and I mean really accurate, floodplain maps and things of that sort. But at least if you can anticipate the kind of questions you might ask, it would at least enable you in theory to make wiser investment decisions on where that capital should go. Now, it seems like the most useful, we have that dilemma here even now, believe it, and I'm sure all of you know this, in terms of trying to get decent floodplain maps established so we know where areas will be at risk. And that's a major concern for the federal emergency management agency and for the Department of Defense as they look at potential scenarios in the out years if, in fact, climate change results in some level of sea level rise. So I think that there is, how you do it is a very good question. What I find in my line of work at least is that there is a tremendous amount of need to promote collaboration across these complex government structures. Even within the federal government, it is complex enough with different agencies and departments. When you consider multiple levels of government trying to get everybody to pull together in the right direction, it really does depend upon the creation not only strong technological networks, but strong human networks to make that work.
Stan, check your mic and make sure that's on, please. We have a question here.
I don't know, I'll just add one more thing. I think, I'm not sure I'm addressing your question directly, but post-Haiti, I could see there was an interest in identifying seismic, Haiti had not been assessed for its seismic hazard and risk, and that ties into a good geographic database, if you will. So post-earthquake, during immediate reconstruction, I think there would have been a real benefit in having those areas outlined and tied to property, and to assess. The question came up: are we rebuilding where we shouldn't? What are the chances for aftershocks destroying newly rebuilt infrastructure? Now, unfortunately, of course, the rebuilding hasn't been going on that quickly. But regardless, in a similar scenario in a different country, perhaps knowing both the seismic risk and identifying parcel data, if you will, would be really important to the international relief community, I think. So in that sense, maybe, yeah, I agree with you.
The other thing is Doug Batson wrote a book. He's with a defense university, and he published a book a couple years ago on the use of land title in not Empire Building, when people accuse us. Yeah, when we're going over to Afghanistan and they accuse us of doing, not we used to call it colonization, but the idea was that we had to have a good imperialism. Yeah, we had to go in there and build a good understanding of the land tenure system and distribute the land ownership and have a good understanding of the land ownership in these countries as part of the long-term sustainability of post-war recovery. But Doug Batson wrote a pretty good book on that. It's published by the Defense University.
I think you're asking about sort of developing countries and land tenure and raising the economics. The answer is, I think it's not a technical problem, it's a social problem. In the Ignite session I'll be talking about that because it's a wicked problem because over the last 30 years World Banks and all of these and aid agencies have poured squillions into it. The record of success is terribly mixed and it's mostly on the downside. And I think there's many lessons that can be learned from that. And I'll touch upon a few of those. Just coming back to, there's other countries, I always find interesting coming to the States. In Australia and New Zealand, we have got cadastres that right across internationally that most would say we couldn't survive without, and we look across at the states and say, yeah, how can a country like this not have a seamless land parcel record system when the cost benefits and all that are so obvious and all of that. Coming to disasters, in Brisbane just recently we had tremendous floods and all of that. As a result of that, the flood mapping was found to be not that good. LiDAR has been used post so that now it's possible to identify each property, get its flood risk. The insurances have all changed, some phenomenally, some areas will not be insured anymore, and the insurance industry is now able to predict how high the flood will go, and if it goes up to a certain thing, what the payout is likely to be, and hence the premiums. And the cadastre is a fundamental tool in that.
In addition to my stock answer of Thomas Jefferson, but the other interesting thing about that is that I heard that ADT goes out and puts alarms in homes, right? And there are 50 million ADT calls to 911 centers across the country every year. 95% of those are false calls. But ADT is a private sector vendor, and they benefit from that because they install the system, and the burden of responding to those calls falls to the taxpayer. So ADT is not motivated to improve their false alarm calls because they don't have to pay for it. They install the systems, they're not in charge of maintaining it, and the local government is, and they figure it costs $600 billion a year for local governments to respond to these false calls. And so the parcel data, long way around, parcel data is like that as well, right? So we have all this parcel data, we have these 4,000 assessors slaving every day to produce these parcel maps. These vendors come in, they get as much of the parcel data as they can, they do a little bit of value add, and they turn around and sell it back to the federal government, they sell it back to state government, they sell it to the insurance companies, they sell it to State Farm, they sell it to FEMA for floodplain management, and so they take the value out of the system, the value goes to the private sector, the money that's made isn't plowed back into the data producer, it's harvested off, the cost of maintaining that system is still driven by the local government, who doesn't see the benefit of the revenue coming back. So it's interesting to have these benefit cost models, and there certainly is a benefit to the floodplains, we've seen it time and time again. The problem is the benefit doesn't go to the local government that produces it. The benefit accrues outside of the people that actually produce the data. So it's a little bit of a wicked problem in terms of doing that economic analysis, because the whole system benefits, but my little Indian down there in the office doing all the work doesn't benefit.
We had 2 questions before this line of conversation. I'm going to get to them because they're next in the queue. We may have to circle back to this conversation because their questions might relate to something we heard earlier. But hang on.
Well, it was related to the question Dave asked. I probably didn't have as strong an appreciation of parcel data until I heard this, and I'd like to confirm it if anybody knows, but I read that one of the key contributing factors to Greece's economic problems is that they've lost control of their parcel data, their tax base, income tax. They've lost it. Anybody can confirm that?
Yeah, I think that's true from what I've read as well. I mean, I only know what I read and hear, but I'm reading that book, White House Burning. It was written by the guy from North Carolina State that wrote the 13 Bankers book, and that's one of their contentions as well in that book, is that Greece has lost control of its real estate tax and income tax system, and the land tenure is very tenuous.
Great. Hi, I'm Diana Sinton from the University of Redlands. And this might start a new thread, so we'll have to circle back to the previous. But Peter, something you just said made me think about this when you mentioned the Haiti earthquake. And I'm wondering, as you were describing the role that the USGS was playing there and thinking about having evaluated the country for its seismic hazards, I was thinking too about the way that the Informal Crisis Mappers Network and its affiliated organizations contributed to collecting geospatial data for Haiti after that, and those data were used a lot by international agencies in their humanitarian relief efforts. And all the examples that we've been hearing about in the last few hours about wicked problems, the data sets that you've been showing in the examples are largely the ones, of course, that have been created over decades and contributed to and maintained by federal agencies and official agencies at different geographic scales. What do you think is the role, the emerging role for any data contributed by informal networks or citizen science groups, or what might it be in wicked problems in general? And I thought about this when I heard some statistic in the last number of years saying that at this point, if any agency, for example, USGS, were to try to, if they were to have to, for example, relaunch let's make topo maps at 1 to 24,000 of the entire US, that it would be impossible, prohibitively expensive to launch that type of data generation project. So I'm just curious, with any of these wicked problems, what is the role of any of this contributed data to these?
I can start. I think it's a great question, and I'll take it in one direction. From the standpoint of where I work, we can certainly see an advantage to having maybe less expensive information that certainly is going to appeal to a large proportion of the Congress. So it in itself is a wicked problem because in our role at CRS, we are driven by the mantra of authoritativeness. So how do you define that? It's not an easy issue even GIS geospatial. Okay, we cite the peer-reviewed literature. That's authoritative until the paper's shown to be wrong. So you have to sort of describe that. But what you're describing is a great dilemma. We want to collect more accurate, better information. And we had the discussion earlier this morning, I think, of tuning the data to the problem, right? Maybe not collecting too much. So there's an advantage there. But I frankly don't know. I mean, I think it's an evolving issue. It's a great issue. We have a wealth of information that's potentially there. I mean, I remember reading about the post tsunami how there was a network at the University of Maryland of people putting up data on where the emergency shelters were, which roads were clear. I mean, that was very useful, right? And that kind of thing can happen. Who was sort of validating that? I don't know. How accurate that was, I don't know. It seemed to work, so maybe that's one measure. From the standpoint of us informing Congress of what data is authoritative, it's a moving target. I think we need to learn more about how these networks are put together, how the data are, what does it mean to be authoritative? And then, again, tune it to the question. Just one example we had a question, I'll just use this specific example. It's not what you're talking about. We got asked, well, how much federal land exists within 100 miles of the border of Canada and New Mexico? It's for a legislative issue. And we went around and around like, well, to what accuracy? Eventually we got smart and asked the requester, the staffer, well, how accurate do you need it? Oh, not that accurate. Oh, easy, within a square mile. But we were thinking, well, we're going to miss whole parcels. We're going to miss whole sections. But we didn't have to. So we took a week-long problem and made it into an hour. But I think that's going to be the key to some degree, is tuning it to the question.
I can give you two examples of that we experienced in the environmental protection world. One was from the BP oil spill, and they both illustrate the dilemma that you have. In the case of the BP oil spill, you had all kind of people who wanted to go out and collect data on what were alleged to be various environmental impacts. And we found ourselves at EPA in a real dilemma on this because, and I'm going to use air data because that's the one that I'm most familiar with. People go out and run samples of different types and get it in. Well, it was a real dilemma because people could get these samples, collect them, and be on the nightly news instantly. We have a quality assurance process for data that we use, and you have different types of sampling mechanisms with different turnaround times and different levels of accuracy. And trying to sort of convey that in a soundbite on CNN is really, really tough. And it creates all kinds of dilemmas for the agency because you don't want to go out and say something which people then rely upon because you said it as an official agency and it turns out later to be wrong. On the other hand, you want to get accurate information out there as quickly as possible. And you mostly just manage and do the best you can and try to explain what it is that you're collecting, why it takes this long to do the analysis, and try to educate, if you will, the news media along with the public on the limitations of some of the data that come in from other sources. So that's one example that it's helpful, but it sometimes creates dilemmas. The second example is on the water quality impacts of surface coal mining. And here it's a somewhat different issue, that in terms of the adverse things that produce adverse water quality impact, you think about things like sedimentation, concentrations of sulfates, carbonates, and so forth in the runoff water. But many of these can be measured by a relatively simple test that tests for conductivity in the water. That the more you have of these ions, the more conductive the water is. And you can measure conductivity in the water with a little device that anybody can carry around with them. And citizen groups in the Appalachian Mountains have taken advantage of this and can go around and use these little meters and give you all kind of data. It does create some quality assurance problems. Plus, you're not sure that you've exactly identified. It's one thing to know what the conductivity is, and it's another thing to know why is it and what would need to be controlled and what the effectiveness of different best management practices would be on the different types of conductivity. So it does give you information and can help you know where to look. Sometimes, if you really want to do a more refined analysis, you have to go deeper.
Can I ask a question of you all? When one of these data sets is collected, people on the street, is there any metadata that goes with it? Where do you find out? Does people jot these things down? And I'm not a GIS person. I just sometimes look at metadata, but that's what I'm told is how you confirm at least the aspects of the data. Do people fill in the blanks, so to speak?
Can we table that for a second? Because we had 2 questions before you, and I want to try to respect everybody who's got. Yeah, we're going to come back to that, though.
Well, hi, Chris Ogier, still unlicensed and uncertified. I wanted to, first off, agree with something you said, Nancy. I love the Thomas Jefferson reference, first off. I think he'd be thoroughly amused by your assessment. And he was unlicensed as well, I believe. I'll say this, your ADT example, fantastic example. If a private sector company is indeed contributing to an overburden on a public agency, they should pay the price for that, in my opinion. They should improve their process so that a reduction in that net effect occurred. On the other hand, your example about, and I'm going to disagree with you respectfully here, your example about value adding on top of public sector data. By its own nature, value adding means work was done on top of something, and therefore value was added, and therefore a charge should be incurred for that. The other side of that too is that just assumes that you can gain access to that parcel data to begin with, which is a tremendous struggle. As you know, it's very personal. Parcels, right? In this state, for example, there's a county that charges $22,000 for their parcels, and there's a county adjacent to it that will give them to you. So the open records laws, the access to the data, all of that plays in. Now, if someone is, for example, industrious and decides they want to add metadata to a crowdsourced data set, should they not have the right to charge for it? And I think that certainly is a valid point. So I just wanted to bring that up.
I actually have to agree with Chris. I mean, I know what you mean. When people add value to it and clean it up, make it better, that's great. It's just from my seat, what I see a lot is like all of Montana's parcel data is available for free as a REST point service. You add it to your canvas and you're done. I cannot tell you the number of federal agencies that have purchased the Montana data.
But isn't that a higher issue?
Well, it is. Is it an ethical issue to sell something that's free, or is it? I don't know.
Should the GAO do that?
I don't know.
Note to me.
Note to me.
On addressing parcels, and I think the question about Greece and how their land tenure is going to, well, if you've been in a local assessor's office, it's one of the most meticulously maintained data sets you'll ever find. So I don't see that happen. They protect it very much. And why they protect it, and with that value added, we hear the academically, all 3,900 and some counties flowing parcels up through a state to the Fed sounds academically so easy to do. Every day doesn't happen, is not going to happen in my career. Just what you mentioned, Chris, about different counties, you would have to change local ordinances, state laws, copyright protection, which state Supreme Courts have allowed you to copyright parcels. There are so many different levels of craziness that I want to know if anybody thinks, if you can, if we got a national parcel data set that was up to date, of course we would have, forget credit default swaps, we'd have solved that whole recession thing, and cured cancer and everything, we've been told. But how do you, is there any conceivable way, Nancy, do you think in the next 20 years we would have a national parcel set that may be updated once a quarter? That's just a crazy question, but just asking. What scenario?
I don't know. I don't think I don't think that's possible. But I also don't think it's needed. There's been a lot of academic call for a national parcel database, and I'm not buying it. And I agree with you, Pat. I mean, I think the data that's maintained locally is very meticulously kept, but I do not know of a single business need that needs all 150 million parcels at a single point in time. You talk about data overload. What they need to know is, like, identify the Everglades. Okay, so there's some issues in the Everglades. Now let's zero that down and let's find out where in the Everglades do we have land property issues where we need to talk to an individual farmer about phosphorus application. Now we need the parcel data to solve that problem at that level. But the granularity of the parcel data at national level, for one thing, I don't think we need it. I think people need parcel data at various points across the country. HUD needs it. You know, we did an inventory. I think there's 32 federal agencies that need parcel data at some point in time, but no one needs it all the time, continuously updated instantaneously. Second thing is, and it's going to harken to your presentation tomorrow, which is iTunes, right? It should be a Netflix iTunes model. It shouldn't be a single national database. It's like it should be when you need it, you get it. I mean, I don't carry my CD. Do you carry your CDs anymore? I don't even. Do you really? No, I don't carry any of that stuff anymore, right? I mean, if I need something, I go get it, and I get it when I need it. So back in the 70s, they had this thing called just-in-time delivery, right? Why not just-in-time data? Why not just go get it when you need it? Why do you have to accumulate it?
Can you reconcile what you're saying right now, which is not a solid need for a national parcel database, geodatabase, with something you said earlier, which was the example of broadband capability and access at the address level? So, okay, you might only be interested in what's the broadband accessibility and capabilities in my town or in my state, but everybody's going to have that concern. So essentially, you're going to have a statewide database view of broadband, just as an example. So reconcile what you're saying with that, please.
So, I mean, to get into the weeds, I mean, there's a lot of ways it could be done. It could be done like Montana, where at the state level, that data is aggregated to meet the state requirements and the state standards, and it's made available on an as-needed basis. And I think that's the approach, and that's where all the states are headed. It's headed to be in a state aggregated system where the state provides the information, and then as you need it, you harvest it from that system and make those decisions. And in terms of the nationwide broadband, Mike Byrne's doing just fine with census block level data. We tried to give him parcel level data for New Mexico, and the system barfed. I mean, it just couldn't handle that many address points at once. It has to use generalized data to make a national, it looks like a pizza map now. I mean, you look at it, it looks like a pizza map.
I get what you're saying. I'm gonna do Randy next and then Carl. But I guess the point I'm getting to is, even though you're only gonna be picking out a certain area of interest, if you don't have the seamless database as your foundation, then if you zone in on an area, for example, across a state boundary, if that's not a seamless database, you may have, one state showing their parcels and then another state showing, and if you overlay those data, then maybe they aren't topologically, accurate, or so. If
you do need don't get me wrong. I mean, I'm a parcel person. I believe that every decision ultimately comes down to who owns land. No matter what happens, the final decision is it has to happen on a parcel by parcel basis. You vote on a parcel by parcel basis. It has to happen. But I don't think the answer is to build a national database. There's not a federal government agency that has the authority to build a national parcel database, but the states do. And so, the hypothesis I have is that, and it's just a hypothesis, is that what we should do is force our funding into the states and help each state build a parcel and an address and a road database that is sustained by the local generated content and made available on a state-by-state basis, and then when you need data, you aggregate it from those state servers. So it's reflective of the local needs and the state regulations. But harvesting all that into a single national database just makes no sense.
Okay, so I think we're segueing then, or maybe the underlying theme that hasn't been really elevated is standards.
Well, we have enough standards. I mean, we've got the standards are written. We can use the standards we have. We don't need new standards. We just need to exercise the ones we have.
Exercise the ones we have for
Yeah,
interoperability. Carl has a
let's
comment.
not go there.
And Carl, I didn't mention this earlier when I introduced him during his panel, but Carl is one of a few people that worked for 5 years completely voluntarily to develop a address standard for the entire United States, which is now actually being looked at as a potential international standard. Is that right?
The Federal Geographic Data Committee had adopted I'm not even going to come close to getting the title right, the U.S. address standard. The Census Bureau is the maintaining authority for that, and the Census Bureau is actively looking at developing data pilots to replace, for those of you who are local entities, the LUCA program, Local Update of Census Addresses, to instead of doing that as a once-a-decade activity, to do it as a continual activity throughout the decade. There could be some really good benefits to doing that. The pilots are going to be starting sometime late summer, early fall. If things are successful, they'll start rolling it out nationally as a data exchange format to all partners early next year. We'll see. No, my comment to Nancy was the difference between parcels and addresses. I think there was one, if you would agree with this, that addresses tend to be semi-static, and they don't have quick changing information like land ownership and land use does. Is that part of the reason why you're more open to and collect aggregations of address information, whereas parcels should be held as close as possible, as long as possible? Do you agree with that?
Addresses are points. There tend to be smaller data, even though it takes more attributes according to the standard to find a parcel point than it does to describe rights and interest in land. But the address points have been useful for us for a number of reasons. One, addresses tend to be assigned to structures, and it's always useful to have a point for every structure. That has a whole lot of applications for floodplain, for planning, for broadband. You know, cows don't use a lot of broadband, so it's kind of useful to just have it go to the structures. And I think addresses and parcels and streets all kind of fall together in that land records genre. So we've talked about that. There's a linkage between addresses and parcels. And it's just parcels have a lot of different kinds of addresses, you know, mailing addresses and owner addresses and site addresses and those kinds of things. But I do think that there's a relationship, and I think, except for the Title 13 constraints of the census, I think, you know, national. I still think that they should go to the state, though, and you should just harvest them when you need them. I don't know what the value is of accumulating it all at the national level.
Hi, I'm Randy Green with Georgia Tech, and Nancy, you just said something that I have to ask a question. How many have heard of mad cow disease?
Oh, mad cow.
You know what? And I don't know if they actually implemented this. I know that they do require IDs on cattle now so they can track their movement, but the next
Get them all
step.
a cell phone.
Yeah, the next step is going to be they'll have a chip so that you can actually track and follow them. So you say cows don't need broadband. The farmers who irrigate in South Georgia need broadband.
They're actually putting RFID chips in them now, and they developed a new battery at Clemson that drives off the cow's muscle, so every time he flexes his muscle, the battery recharges, and they're putting these thumbnail-size RFIDs in these cows, and you can kind of track. It's kind of an interesting.
It's interesting. One of the issues that was driving broadband in Georgia was related to the water issue that we saw on the map from EPA. The wells in southwest Georgia are monitored in real time, you know, on outtake and all that stuff. So, you know, here were farmers miles from any service, and they needed connectivity.
Yeah.
That was an issue, which is really not why I stood up, but when you said that, it just reminded me of it. And I work in an area not directly related to GIS. It's more of a tool that I'm interested in applying in the work that we do with industry and energy and those issues. But I'd mentioned to Danielle the importance of having standards around the work that we do. One of the things that you're describing that, you know, I would encourage this group to do, or whatever comes out of conversations like this, is if you can have the model in place for the way the data is formed, then it's easy to share, and the whole concept of having to marry it at a high level is not as important. It's kind of like where we've gone with cloud computing. If you think about that model, I don't need one big address file in my server to have access to all the addresses. I just need access to this well-formed data that lives in a lot of places, and I can get to it in that mode. And so I don't know if the standards exist. You know, one of the ways to attack that is to you know, work on putting a committee together to look at adopting, and maybe through ANSI or somebody like that, and actually writing the standards to try and get them into policy.
I think Randy's point is valid, and I think it gets back to some earlier conversation about too many chefs in the kitchen and not enough prep chefs. We do have some standards, but we have kind of a lot of them, and which makes it not standards, I guess.
I mean, I think the standards are greater, but you should have one. But you know, we do have a lot of standards, and I do think we could exercise the ones we have. I mean, the cadastral standard's been around since 1990 or something, and it could all be implemented. And I'm not sure that going through another standards writing exercise is necessary. Plus the concept of the turnstile, the ability to standardize on the fly, to flip through a turnstile is here now with the clouds. So a lot of clouds will standardize on intake. So that's what Census is looking at. Is they'll take any data you have, and then they have a data depot, and they're going to standardize on intake. That's a lot easier.
I do want to comment on this on an environmental side, because I am told that the database that EPA maintains on its so-called compliance data system of permit discharge records from the NPDES, that's right, the NPDES permit system is in fact the second largest data set in the entire United States, next to the Internal Revenue Service. And it was built on a model, interesting enough, that the data would go into states and the states would then report it to EPA. And for the last decade, we've been trying to transform that into a model where the data is maintained with the data steward, if you will, at the state level and maybe at the local level, and EPA would be able to go in and retrieve it. That may seem simple, but it in fact has not been. It does require a lot of work with respect to data standards, as you described. So whether we have enough data standards in the EPA world, it may be, as you say, though, just a matter of using the standards that we have. And that has in itself turned out to be a wicked problem, in part because of funding constraints at state and local levels.
And it was all collected over a variety of so many years. The processes for how it was collected, so it's not a consistent data set.
That's correct. For
it's
simple pollutants,
rich.
for simple pollutants, it's not so bad. But certainly for the more complex pollutants, it is.
Mark Gislow from Lakeland Community College in Ohio. I just wanted to comment on future directions in technology with the seamless national database or something that approximates it. I think it's coming, whether the standards are there or not, because the technology is going to make it possible. The end user may perceive it as a seamless database. It may not in reality be a single database, but that doesn't mean it won't have the same effect. And so, you know, likely as we look at reasons this might happen, there are a bunch of federal related reasons, everything from the IRS to national security to emergency management, some of which may not be something that everyone's going to agree on. Also regional planning across states. If states begin in a serious way to bring their parcel data sets up to the statewide level, it doesn't take very long to figure out that in places like, let's say, the Chicago region, which stretches across 3 different states in some way, there are all kinds of economic development reasons that those states can pretty easily start then to think regionally about how they handle those parcel data sets. So I think that's probably going to happen whether we're prepared or not. Another kind of compelling interest in this is the development of a national smart grid for electricity generation and transmission. And so as we look at the coming kind of changes in alternative energy, all of a sudden parcel ownership and assignment and understanding of parcel at a national level becomes something that could be an important component of upgrades to that electricity system that may come, so.
Comments on that? We got our energy engineer over here.
Well, I'm sorry I didn't catch your name, but your comment reminded me of the other thing I was going to say, which was about wicked problems in general, which are the ones that are really significant or impactful. They will solve themselves whether people manage the solution to that or not. And I say that to say that the world will move on with solutions to some of the issues we're discussing. Things will get resolved, you know, outside of the professional community because some entrepreneur will figure out a way, or Buchan and Davis wrote a good book called The Monster Under the Bed about, you know, the lethargy of higher education and how business was going to move past them, and it's a good read if you haven't read it. But I wanted to just remind you of what happened about 4 or 5 years ago, and I can't remember the specifics, and I apologize. But Google Analytics predicted about 2 or 3 weeks the outbreak of influenza in the Midwest before the CDC could compile it from doctors' records. It was enough information from what people were searching for to know that there was a health crisis in this part of the country. And when you think about health, you know, how important is the timeliness of a response, especially in responding to pandemic type issues like that. So other technologies are going to either outdate some of what we're talking about or move beyond us. And, you know, so I think trying to find solutions in a flexible framework that gives enough information, as we talked about, to resolve or answer the question, but not get caught up in the weeds of, you know, how precise is it and is it everything that we need or, you know, is perfect in that sense.
I'm reminded that your comment reminded me of something my son once told me, something with a college. He looked at me and said, I was talking about some problem or other, and he says, Dad, nature doesn't care what you think.
True.
That was a great example about Google solving the problem and it not having a national, it's going to happen, but it may not happen in the traditional sense that we keep talking about. Great, and Google, I'm not a salesman, neither are you, but national imagery for the nation. Well, all of us can go to Google Maps or Bing and look at that stuff. They've already done that on the because there was a consumer need. They found a way to do it because somebody wanted it done. Now, the bureaucracy that we're watching and these traditional methods to get a national parcel, I don't think anybody disagrees that that would be a great idea and useful, but it's not, I personally don't believe it's going to happen the way it's been continuing. So it'll just work. Somebody will find a business reason, whether it's a bank, a group of lawyers, but there are groups of people that will fight it because of their own personal interests. But it's not going to, there's going to be a different situation, maybe just not the way we keep thinking about it. And the wickedness and the problem is the differences in laws, the differences in the groups that want to stop it versus the bureaucracy of actually trying to do it in the traditional method. So I don't think anybody disagrees, it's just how do we get there? And that sparked my thought about Google. Imagery is the same thing. There's a commercial business reason to do it that citizens want.
So I've heard this analogy, Peter, if you don't mind. Google makes maps like the grocery store makes eggs. I mean, they are starting to actually acquire data where they didn't so much before. On their own dime. And so what I'm saying is not as relevant anymore, but still they deliver data that exists and was acquired at the local, regional, and state levels. They're not the source of the information, generally speaking. So I'm always perplexed by if Google sees the user need and they're putting money into it, why aren't we doing that at a local, regional, and state level like we could be and should be, I guess. I don't know. But Peter, you wanted to comment and then we'll go back to you.
Well, I just wanted to ask sort of a question. What about, just to get the sense of the room, is there a need for federal single federal cadastre of federal lands? It's something that comes up with us from time to time. We're asked how much land does the federal government own, plus or minus X amount. And is that, I mean, certainly from our standpoint, from a matter of convenience, yeah, it'd be nice to go to one place. I mean, there's a national map, but, you know, something greater than square mile accuracy. Is that something worth doing? It comes up in policy issues for some of us because of things like payments in lieu of taxes to Western lands, things like that. How accurately do we know the data, who owns it, and other things like that, settlements, Indian reservations, things like that. But what do you think? Do we need that? Is it something that's possible? It hasn't been possible so far, but.
Yes, and I think it's.
Well, I just had something very quick on the federal database. I mean, to me, it seems like a no-brainer, but then I don't work for the federal government, so what do I know about it? But I assume that Interior and Bureau of Land Management and everyone else has their own individual data set right now. I mean, that stuff seems like it will be integrated one way or the other. I think, you know, what has kept us back from this is just simply vision. I mean, we don't always perceive that there's a need until we need it. I mean, it's like anything else that we do that changes. So our traditional way of viewing parcels, if they were the county's problem, they were the auditor's problem, well, now they're everybody's problem. So.
Hey, Carl.
In some ways, it sounds like we're actually arguing for a robust implementation of the NSDI. That the promise of the national spatial data infrastructure just hasn't been realized, that the data that you get from there isn't the best data available from the feds, and good data is not coming in. And
Well, back in the Nancy Tosta days of the NSDI, and she talked about either the top-down or the bottom-up kind of thing. I mean, what we didn't have then that we have now is the cloud. What we didn't have then that we have now is the ability to have REST point services. I mean, those technologies were not in the vision of the original NSDI. I mean, when Al Gore invented the internet, he didn't have this in mind. And so, you know, we've evolved. And so what hasn't evolved is our bureaucracies haven't evolved, and our thinking has not evolved, and the way we address the problems have not evolved. And so all I'm suggesting is that maybe there's a better way to think about this. You know, personally, I think Montana's way ahead of the game. Montana took all of the federal ownership in the state of Montana and reconciled it with the local property tax records. So in Montana, the federal ownership is known to the nearest acre, tenth of an acre, because it's been surveyed and reconciled against the local land ownership, and state ownership is known to that level. Montana is not the richest state in the union. It just happens to have a whole bunch of land, right? And Ted Turner. So, I mean, it's an Atlantic connection, you know. But there's this concept of having distributed points. Not only is it more secure, it's more easily managed, it's more adaptable, it's more easily respondable to local conditions. There are true business needs at the state level to have every parcel in the state accounted for to manage state programs. It's the Confederate model. We're in the South, right? It's states' rights. It works. It works.
And that does identify a different way of thinking, because states generally aren't as concerned about federally owned lands or even
yes, they are very
nonprofit
concerned about federally owned lands, and the point is that
because they're exempt.
Well, but they are here too, because the Forest Service owns a lot of land, the Corps owns buckets of land, and believe me, you know, in South Carolina where they stand up and say to Lindsey Graham, I don't want the federal government messing with my Medicare. This is the same place, right? Where you get it. But this is the same place where they have the Corps of Engineers. It impacts people every day. And so we want to know what the federal government owns, but the way to do it is to integrate it at the local level. Have the local assessor and the federal agencies reconcile the management. Then it's the most accurate it can possibly be.
Yeah, and I would add, I mean, sort of a subset of the comment I made earlier, that you shouldn't overestimate, at least as someone who does work for the federal government, you shouldn't overestimate how much each agency knows about what the others do. And in some ways, it's not a data problem, it's a human problem. In fact, a couple of convening organizations I do, there's one organization called the Southeast Regional Partnership for Planning and Sustainability, whose whole objective is to produce what they call the good map. The good map, which is so that all these different things that the various agencies have can be overlaid, and you can look at them to solve wicked problems like how do you preserve particular endangered species? Well, it turns out that one of the things you can do is you look at federal inholdings of land that the Defense Department owns, tie those together with lands purchased by conservation organizations to create corridors that promote wildlife management or help preserve longleaf pines. Pretty cool. But it does take a certain collaborative skill, a convening skill to pull those things together just so people can sit around a room like this one and exchange information and find out what they know and what they don't know about what each other does. And then to mobilize the leadership support behind it.
I want to go back to Peter's question about metadata, but before I do, does anybody have anything heartburning that they want to say before we switch gears there? Because after that, I'm going to do the wrap up. Okay, Peter, what was your comment about metadata again? Sorry.
I forgot about it. I guess it was back in the topic of crowdsourcing, back in the Pleistocene when we were talking about it. And just sort of along the theme of for us, the non-practitioner who wants to use geospatial analysis, we're always concerned about authoritativeness and where the data comes from, how good is it. So I just don't know. I mean, in terms of crowdsourced data, what do people use to annotate that information, I guess? Validate or annotate it, to give some other information besides just a point. I don't know.
Well, I think that in the disasters, like in the Jefferson fire, Jefferson, Colorado, we had Twitter feeds and we had social media feeds, and we were tracking the spread of the fire. And the way that the FEMA guy that was monitoring those feeds was getting the metadata was he was watching for repeated observations of the same thing. And so as he started to get repeats, then he would assign those repeats to certain observers. And then he had these classes, he had your hysterical response, which we tossed out because there were certain feeds were coming in, there were just people that were just whacked. And then we had people that were good intention, but not great data. And then we had crowds that were coming in that was just good data. And so that filter developed on an ad hoc basis just by doing observations. And then we had cops and federal employees in the field, and we were trying to double up and verify. So wherever we could get a verify, then we could say, okay, there's a good feed. Every time that feed comes in, there's a reliable observer. So it's a very humanization of the thing, and I mean, I don't know how ethical it is, to say, this one's not so good and this one's pretty good, but it was the only way they could filter. So that's one method, but I mean, people aren't going to tell you that stuff. You're going to have to gather it,
Okay.
Has anybody else done anything else with crowdsourcing to verify it? Pat?
I would say in most cases you don't even need to do that.
Because it self-verifies, right?
It's self, and this is kind of messing with the last slide I'm going to show tomorrow, but we're sensors now. Yeah. This thing, Google traffic, do I care if I give good data? No, I'm part of the sensor. I'm part of the system now. So if I get bad data, the comment was made earlier about being on the Autobahn and he kept getting off, right? The authoritative sign said there was something up ahead, right?
Yeah.
But Google traffic, I'm part of the sensor network. I would have seen that, wow, everybody's going at 50 some miles an hour, I'm good to go. I don't care, when I drove over here yesterday, I didn't care about authoritative data. Does it work? And I'll keep using it until it doesn't.
One of the first things I learned as a geologist, I was told, maybe this is blasphemy, is the map is not the reality. Does that somehow play into this? I don't know.
Yeah. At some point you have to go outside and look, right? You can't sample forever. At some point you got to go out and look.
Okay, I want to work with you all to capture the key takeaways from this panel session